Good evening, Polly, Dr. Polly Young-Eisendrath. It's a pleasure to have you here at Breakfast at Kuznach. Your profile is so interesting. You are a Jungian analyst, you are a Buddhist, Zen practitioner. You have a podcast called Enemies from War to Wisdom. And I'm delighted to be here today to talk about coronavirus, this crisis, and especially to take a look from the Buddhist point of view.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you, Stefano.
I would like to start from you're a Zen practitioner, a Buddhist. Can you tell us when this interest started for you?
So when I was a young person, I was really in my childhood. I had many experiences that you could call spiritual experiences, or you could call them psychotic experiences. They are really in that range of being kind of otherworldly. And I was a practicing Catholic during that time, but I also was not a person who knew a lot about the Catholic religion. We lived out in the country, and I was separated a lot from other people. I was slightly schizoid in my way. And so I never really could put my spiritual experiences together with the religion. And eventually, when I was about 19, I left the Catholic Church and I began to practice different religions to see what they were like. So I practiced Judaism for a while. I practiced Quakerism. I practiced Vedanta. And then eventually I got to Zen Buddhism. And that's where I said, this is it. This is what I'm looking for. And, you have to think of, here I am just out of college. My studies had been primarily in medieval studies. I was going to be a professor of medieval literature way back then. And, but I was looking for a religion that was about everyday experience, but the transcendent aspects of everyday, not the salvation, not the future, but moment to moment. What is going on here? So when I was growing up, I grew up in a very poor working class household. My parents had not even attended a high school. They had both left school at the age of 13 because they were from very poor families. So naturally, they didn't know anything about any of this. And also, there was quite a lot of violence in my household and in the surrounding households. So as a child, I had formulated this sort of question, though I hadn't asked it, like, what's going on here? What is this life that we're in? It's not a happy life. I did not have the kind of childhood that you would have nostalgia for, But I had the kind of childhood that presented spiritual questions. Like, what's going on here? Why do these people fight so much? What's war? What is all of this? My father had been in the war. And so when I got to Zen Buddhism, it seemed like this was going to be the place to find the answers to those questions. And so I dived into it at the age of 22. And it took about 4 years for me to realize, and of course my life was going on in other ways, and I was involved in really in the Black Power movement, not just in the civil rights movement, but in a lot of issues surrounding the African-American community. My husband taught at an African-American college. I worked in an African-American university. But in the midst of that, I began to see that the people practicing Zen had a lot of psychological problems, and that they were not actually able, in some ways, to really live at the same time they were doing the practice. Now, again, most of this was fairly inchoate. It wasn't as though I thought it all through, but I began to see things. And so I said, I really need to go to psychotherapy. That's what I need. I mastered quite a bit of concentration practice in my early days. But I was also in a constant state of fear during these intensive retreats called sessions or sessions. And I was sometimes, I would say, in a trauma, a kind of a titrated trauma, which I think is a part of Zen training, actually, because it brings you to the edge of your ordinary awareness. So during those times, I could see that the people around me hadn't really mastered some of the issues that I was concerned with. Particularly, I was very concerned with psychotic experience because I had witnessed some of it in my father. So, sort of fast forwarding, I read Memories, Dreams, Reflections, and of course I fell in love with Jung. It wasn't just that I liked his ideas. I fell in love with him, and I wanted to kind of go to Zurich and see what all of this was about. And eventually, my analyst was June Singer, and I did go to Zurich eventually too. And I had an analyst there, and a very intensive analysis just for a summer. Somebody named Ernest Bell, who is dead now. But so I dived into the psychotherapy world through Jung. And as I progressed in that, I decided I wanted to become a psychotherapist. In a way, I would say I wanted to become Jung. It wasn't just good enough to go to therapy, but now I wanted to do that. I wanted to become that. And so I ended up going for a graduate degree in social work, and I had my children about the same time. And then once I got into graduate school, I started being interested in a particular form of developmental psychology called ego development. Jane Levenger originated that. I was at Washington University in St. Louis. And so I decided, oh no, I really want to go on in psychology now and become a researcher and an academic in psychology. And at the same time, I was continuing in my analysis. I was living in St. Louis and traveling back and forth to Chicago to see June Singer. So in that chapter of my life, what eventually happened is I did become an academic. I was at Bryn Mawr College in Philadelphia for 10 years. I got tenure. And by the time I got tenure, I decided I didn't want to do that any longer. This is the nature of my life. My life is usually, I'll go into something, I go into it very, very deeply. And then I see something else, and I want to do that. So I do that very deeply. And then I see something else. So by the time I finished my Jungian training, I was an academic, and I could have stayed my whole career being an academic. But I decided actually I wanted to change my whole life. By this time I was remarried, and I wanted to move to Vermont, away from a city, and develop my home as a spiritual retreat center, and change all of my kind of worldly life to move away from what I saw many of my colleagues doing, which was, they would buy a second house, or they would buy a boat, or they would do something to kind of bring ease to the stress that their lives had.
Something very extroverted.
Very well, and also assuming that if you're going to stress yourself so much in your daily life, you need to do something, to deal with the stress, right? So in 1994, I moved to Vermont. And gradually I developed, my husband, who's now died from early onset Alzheimer's, which is a whole other chapter. I went back to more intensive Buddhist practice because I had moved away from Buddhist practice during the years when I was training to be a psychologist and also finishing my Jungian training. I wasn't practicing with a teacher. I had started out with Philip Kapleau and practicing with him. I had moved away from the practice. And then when I went back to the practice, which was actually in 92, I actually went back to practicing with Philip Kapleau again. I got very close to him. And I actually was involved in editing and publishing his unpublished papers, and I knew him quite well in his later years. And then at some point, he said to me, you have to find another teacher. I can't teach you anymore. I'm too old. And by that time he had Parkinson's diagnosed at 72. He died at 92. So, he lived with it a long time, but he got too sick to really be teaching anymore. I mean, he became completely paralyzed. So at that point, I actually started with another teacher, someone named Shinzen Young, who is actually a Vipassana teacher, but he, many of his years, he was the Japanese translator for a Zen teacher named Sasaki Roshi at Mount Baldy, who was Leonard Cohen's teacher, who is notorious now for having, sexually abused a number of his students. That's a very long story and a very big one. But in any case, my teacher was one of his Japanese translators, and so knew the teachings of Sasaki Roshi very well and could convey them in a different sort of framework. So I started practicing with Shinzen in 96, 97. I then started going on Vipassana retreats, which are quite different from the Zen retreats. And I proceeded to actually spend quite a lot of time with Shinzen and practiced with him a lot, taking me up to about 2007, 2008. And at that point, I knew that my husband, Ed Epstein, who was in his mid-50s, I knew that he had early onset Alzheimer's. So I knew he was going to die, and I knew that he was going to lose all of his capacities to function. So I went through that process with him. He was also a Buddhist practitioner. And it was an extraordinary experience. It's hard to even, I wrote a memoir called The Present Heart, which is a memoir of love, loss, and discovery. But I discovered so much about the dying process. I also discovered a lot about Alzheimer's, and I ended up then beginning to practice a Tibetan practice as well, called POA, which is the practice of conscious dying. It's the practice of basically the transmission of consciousness at the time of death to basically. It's a technique for entering into death in a particular way. And so in 2008, I went to my first POA retreat with a very old Rinpoche, or a very, let's say, also very renowned and great master of POA named Ayang Rinpoche. And so I have continued to practice POA. And I also practice Zen, because there's a Zen center up the road from me where I go to practice. As a friend of mine runs that center. I have a Zendo in my home. And right now I've just entered in with a new teacher to do koan study. I have never done koan study before. And so now I've begun doing that. So my entire adult life has been undergirded by Buddhist practice, but also I have equal interest in psychoanalysis, because I think Buddhism misses a certain part of functioning. And what I would call the part is that it misses the intersubjective. So Buddhism is very good with the individual subjective, and paying attention, and also the group. Because you function in Zen, particularly, the group is almost like a unity. It's like an animal. And so you can feel the group and the power of the group. You can feel yourself and your own experience. But that dyad, that is very much a part of psychoanalysis, is not studied in Buddhism. So I gave you a long answer. I hope it was in the direction that you were interested.
It was a beautiful answer, because it helps me to introduce the next question. My wish is to talk with you about what is going on right now. Coronavirus, COVID-19, lockdown in many, many countries of the world, not just of the Western world, Europe and the US. You said that you wrote a memoir about your husband, Alzheimer, and you said love, loss, and discovery. Isn't this time a bit, with much respect, about love, loss, and discovery? How do you feel about this new time? We are in an unprecedented time since 2 weeks, a time of uncertainties. How do you feel about it?
So from, I speak first as a Buddhist, okay, because I actually think you're contacting me partly for that.
Yes.
So, with every sensitivity to the tremendous suffering that's going on, I'm also aware of the tremendous teaching. So the virus is teaching us. And, you could say, well, how do I think about that? I think that one of the most difficult things for humans to master is uncertainty. We have such a desire to control, and it's built into the prefrontal lobes. We want to predict and we want to control. It's not like even, let's say, something like desire. It's more like machinery. We almost must predict and control. Yeah. And you could say that's the human ego, or you could say it's the executive function, or you could say it's our creativity. There are many ways to call it, but it is this desire to nail down the future and to know what's going to happen to us. And the other animals here, they don't have it like that. We have a very bad case of it, this prediction and control. And so the virus actually interferes with that tremendously. And so we're sort of face to face with the fact that living here on Earth is tremendously uncertain. Because from the moment we come into being, and this is true of all the beings that are here, we also come into dying. So life and death are in this world wrapped up together. You cannot separate them. And of course, if you really only want life and you don't want death, then you're tremendously anxious. And then if you feel that you're really in, let's say, trapped in a situation where you can't protect yourself or others, you may also feel tremendously depressed. So this world of life and death, in Buddhism, it's called Samsara. It's the wheel of life and death. It actually presents us with deep uncertainty, but we try to ignore it. And in the West, but also in the East, really, it's everywhere, because everywhere that humans are is the desire to control. And humans create hierarchy. They create situations where some people are on the bottom and some are on the top. And, and a lot of that is about control, right? Wanting to succeed, wanting your family to succeed, wanting the things that you want to succeed. So the virus is teaching us how to live with uncertainty. And something that I think probably the Homo sapien in the paleo times, whatever the paleo times were, was living with a lot more uncertainty, moment to moment, right? So had to be really alert, really, really aware of the present moment. And the present moment, I just heard Eckhart Tolle talk about uncertainty in a way I liked very much. Uncertainty teaches us to value the present moment, because moment to moment to moment, we really are okay, but if we don't notice that, we get wrapped up into our anxieties and our depressions and so on, and the desire to control. So that's one thing I think the virus is teaching. I think it's also teaching, and in a way that I don't feel that I understand yet at all, but it's teaching deeper lessons of interdependence, or dependent arising from the Buddhist teaching, that there are causes and conditions in which we are all arising, in which we all live. We cannot know them because we don't have the mind of God. We have a little mind, and we can only see what we can see. And yet we're always bound to these conditions. And so we're never separated from them. So all of our actions really affect the conditions in which we live. And I think that when you recognize the virus comes from Wuhan, which was really, and I think still is, manufacturing a lot of the products, the iPhone and the iPad and so on. And a lot of people all over the world want to use those products. And so there was lots of commerce going back and forth from Wuhan to other parts of the world. And whatever started the virus, whether it was the wet markets where some animals were killed, or whether it was some other situation, it got to the rest of the world really fast, really, really fast. And that's unusual.
You talked about uncertainties in the past few days, and even in my past interviews. We talked about the suspension of time. We live a suspended time. And this made me think, okay, we are living a suspended time. The cities are totally empty. But maybe more than a suspended time, we should talk about the suspension of certainties.
Mm-hmm.
And linked to the suspension of certainties, there are the few emotions you mentioned: anxiety, angst, panic, so on and so forth, which are the emotion maybe you feel these days, that the people around you, even your patients, feel these days, if you can name one or few.
Well, in a way, being a Buddhist practitioner and having gone through my husband's very long death, and during which I lost all of the money we had made and so on, because very often when people have early onset Alzheimer's, the finances are the first to go. And that was the case for us. He was running the finances. So I lost all of my status financially. When I knew his diagnosis, I knew that I would lose more. I had to figure out a lot of things really quickly, and there really wasn't anyone to help because no one around me really could understand it. So it was quite a lot like this moment. And I realized, okay, now the book that I thought I was in, the narrative I thought I was creating, is over. There's not that narrative anymore. Now I'm in something else, but I don't even know what it is. And so I really better pay close attention. So myself, I'm not really so anxious about anything. I instead, and this was new for me, honestly, I was angry. I was very angry at the way decisions were being made. Not so much from the point of view of, let's say, the lack of medical knowledge or the lack of preparedness of the hospitals, because I already knew that that was going to be the case, but more that the decision-making happened really quickly and from the top down. And there are many, many issues that individuals never had a chance to in any way review. All of our rights were taken away from us. And for example, one of my patients, a couple that I saw in therapy, and I do a lot of couples therapy, I had seen them, the last time I saw them was in the fall. They had gone to Belize, and on the way back, they're both in their, well, she was in her late 60s, he in his 70s. They contracted the virus in the airport, probably. I came back to Vermont. He got very sick. They tested both of them. They both had the virus. She had no symptoms. He died from it. But he died because he had MS, and he also died directly from a heart attack related to the medicine that was given to him because of his extreme difficulties in the hospital. But she could not see him at all. She could not go into the hospital. She saw him die on FaceTime. And that separation and isolation from people who are dying is happening everywhere, in the nursing homes, in the residential care centers, people who actually are in tremendous need of some kind of contact, have no contact with their families except for the FaceTime or this type of thing. And even as people have said to me, there are many people who would risk getting the virus to be able to be with a loved one when they're dying, but they have no rights. They can't sign a paper saying, I'll take that risk and go in to see my loved one when my loved one is dying. Now, I have gone through the dying process, not just seeing somebody, but going through the whole process 5 times with friends, including my husband. And it's a tremendously important process in life. How you go through it, what happens, you learn so much going through it. And when you love somebody, it's tremendously helpful to go through it with them. And so we've been cut off from that right without ever having been consulted. So there are many, many rights. I'm just really mentioning one that has troubled me. There are many rights that people have been cut off from without ever being consulted. And we don't know when those rights are going to be replaced again. We don't know. There's no end date for this. There's no point at which we're being told, okay, even if we reach this point, then you can go see your loved ones when they're dying, So I got very, very angry about the rights being taken away without any consulting of anyone, really, from governments that, from a government perspective that seems very distant from where I live and any of the people that I know. We're all in lockdown like you are, but we're also deprived of being able to be with our loved ones when they're dying, of going into the hospital with somebody who's having a baby, just many, many things that we might be willing to do, to sacrifice, because it's a deep human transitional process, having a baby, dying, and so on. So what I noticed about myself, and I had not had this during Ed's dying, during my husband's dying, was just this feeling of anger, like, no, don't do all of this. Yes, we need to keep people safe. Yes, we need to create certain kinds of barriers, but we also need to understand the virus. What is this virus where a couple, just a few years apart, one of them dies and the other one doesn't have any symptoms, and they're both test positive? This we have to understand a little bit. Like, what is this? And we rush into making so many rules and decisions without understanding it, and then tremendous panic, tremendous fear in the media, and and I happen to live in a state that's quite unpopulated. The numbers in my county have been very low, but everybody is wearing masks, everybody is wearing gloves, everybody looks terrified all the time, and there's sort of no leadership to help people actually see where I live, we're really not in that much threat from the virus. We will be from the economic conditions that are created, but we will be also from not being able to be with our loved ones when they're dying. I have a friend who's in a care center. She hasn't seen her daughter. She hasn't seen anyone, and she's not allowed to eat with the other residents there. It's just draconian, bizarre. So that's where I personally have been. And so I've been working on that. It's partly a koan for me. It's one reason why I'm going back to do koan practice, because I've been so sort of snagged by that. But then with the people that I work with in therapy, I really try to convey to them the issue of being alert, being aware, moment to moment, really checking what is going on, what actually is going on with your family right now. Many people are actually enjoying this time with their family. I'm not everyone, and some people are, in difficult situations at home with their family too. But there's a lot that's happening if you pay attention to it on a moment-to-moment basis that has not happened in the 21st century. People are staying at home, they're having dinners at home, they're with their children more, they're maybe doing more spiritual practice. Maybe they're on the screens a lot, but they're in contact that way. So there is another side to everything that's going on. And if you can help people step into that and not panic, and to be able to see that we do not know what is going to happen. We do not know. That doesn't mean it's going to be bad. It just means we don't know. And in Zen, there's a teaching called the don't know mind, which is that you don't know from moment to moment. You basically look at this world and you say, what is this? What is it? What is it? Until you go so deeply into that the difference between you and the world just disappears. Because it's not as though there is just something out there.
It reminds me of what Wolfgang Gigerich said a couple of months ago in a supervision to me about hopes and expectation. Stop all hopes and expectations. Only this way longings will be able to come up from the soul.
Mm-hmm.
But in a very, as you said, in a world where the human wants to be the master and uncertainty is a problem, is very difficult. Let me ask you a very difficult question. You talked about Poa, so it's time to talk about death. Because these crises also put death on our face.
Yes.
Especially because the time of death in someone's life has been postponed. And now technology, as you said, can help. In this crisis, ventilators are fundamental to save lives. And the shortage of ventilators is seen as a problem. But 100 years ago, when the Spanish flu was hitting very hard, there were no ventilators, there was the technology that was there. So now technology can stop death,
Mm-hmm.
to let us die after, and even to create life.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to go into this question, what about technology, but what about death? What is death from a Buddhist point of view?
It's a transition. It's a transition. So again, the question about death is really the question about life. There's no distinction. And I think this is very difficult for people to cognize it. It might be a little easier in Asia because there was no Descartes in Asia. There was no separation. So the inside and the outside, and the individual and the group, and the life and the death, and so on, is more of a process, you might say. In Asia, it's not like there is a strong boundary. In the West, was the result of the Greeks, really. I don't know if you know the book, The Geography of Thought. Do you know this book? I highly recommend it. It's about the difference between Greek thought and philosophy and Chinese thought and philosophy. And it's by an American psychologist whose name I'm just blanking out on right now. But he's a famous psychologist. But he writes really well about something that I think is very difficult for Westerners to recognize, which is that our worldview colors all of our perception. So we in the West have been colored a lot by the Greeks. And the Greeks actually wanted to find eternal being. They wanted to find a stable being. And the Chinese never even imagined there would be such a thing. It's all process, right? And from the let's say classical Chinese point of view. And so Buddhism originates in India. It's kind of between the Far East and the West. It's really, Sanskrit is cognate with the Western languages, So in a certain way, Buddhism originates in this culture that's between the East and the West. But already, of course, in Indian culture, by the time the Buddha was existing, there was already the complete knowledge of rebirth. So it was a process, the death, the rebirth, and the life. And so the kind of goal of Buddhism is to get off of the wheel of life and death, to transcend the samsara, this place where life and death are bound together, and everything is impermanent, and everything actually leads to the next thing. So the point of the practice originally is to get off of that entire world cycle. And so from Buddhism, death is a transition, and it's the beginning of another life existence, but it's not the same thing as reincarnation in the typical way of looking at it, because in Buddhism, it's a moment to moment to moment. So that when you're going through the dying process, you're moving gradually out of the consciousness of this life that you've been in, and you gradually let that go, and then you move into another existence, another life. But it's more like one candle lighting another candle, or a wave moving to the next wave. There's not that much continuity. So most people have no memory, of a previous life. So from my point of view, death is not an enemy. Death is a transition. And if you actually are able to accompany somebody through the dying process, you will see so many things that happen, as long as the person is not too medicated, particularly on morphine. Although sometimes morphine is okay too if the person's in so much pain, it allows consciousness to remain. But as you go through, you see that there are stages in dying, just like there are stages in being born. And you see also that the person retains consciousness and is involved in the dying process all the way into the actual transition from the breath leaving the body. From a Buddhist point of view, that is not the end. And then if you're really close to that person, you will, through your dreams, be able to continue for a while as that being makes a transition. So, from my point of view, in this time of dying, what I see with the people that I see in therapy is that it's almost like the virus has broken this barrier that we have to thinking about death. It's like the whole thing is coming to the surface. And so people who have not actually been able to engage with the idea of their dying, or with people who have died, because, I've seen many people in therapy over the years who were facing their own death, but they had never seen anyone die. So it was a completely like another planet they're going to. They've never actually gone with somebody through the dying process, which pretty much anywhere in India and in many parts of Asia, you would, by the time you get to be old, have seen many people die. You would have gone through it with them. You see them actually die. And in the West, we were hiding a lot of it. So now it's coming up in their dreams. It's coming up in their fears. And I'm talking about it with them. So what do you think death is? I'll ask, what is it? How do you imagine it? What is it? Would you think it's a nothing? If it's a nothing, why are you afraid of it? So, basically, I think that the virus is bringing this issue of death, which from my point of view, life and death are bound together. So the other side of what we call life is death, moment to moment. It's like breathing in and breathing out. And we have no guarantees that we have a future. And if you also say, well, you were alive in the past, Well, I mean, most of us can't really remember yesterday very well. You know, we remember a few things, but so we don't have really anything but the present moment because there really isn't any other moment. We have narratives about the past, we have these things we call memories, but humans have 5 different memory centers in the brain. So we don't have any videotape of what happened to us. You know, we're always making it up. And also, we don't know what's going to be in the future. So, in the so-called future. So, from a Buddhist perspective, the transition at the time of death is a very important transition. And that the actual moment of dying is one of the most important moments of your life. And so, the way that you die, if you die with confidence and you are having that sense of being okay when you're dying, you're going to go through with a lot more ease and a lot more awareness than if you're terrified in the hospital, cut off from everybody you love, not being able to be comforted by anybody that knows you even. You will be much more afraid in the actual dying process, that moment of death, which again, from a Buddhist perspective, that moment, unfortunately or fortunately, has a major impact on your forward movement, into existence beyond the dying itself. So, of course, we can help at a long distance. We can offer prayers. We can offer encouragements. And I think when people see somebody on FaceTime, I haven't had that experience. I don't know what it's like, but I imagine they can somewhat reach the person. But so, from Buddhism, death is not the enemy. Death is inherently part of the contract that you signed when you came here. And it's as important as living, because if you also keep it in mind, it actually makes very clear many, many things. It makes very clear how everything, everyone it's all impermanent. It will all be gone soon. And so this is the time to be happy with it, to be engaged with it, to understand it, to connect with it, because it will go quickly. And if you keep your death in mind, that, and if you actually get a picture of any moment, how many beings are living and dying, it's like, so many are going out at any moment. And then there are others, they're coming in, all beings are going out and coming in, moment to moment to moment. And right now, a lot of human beings are having to think about all of that in a way that I think most of the people that I see, even in therapy, they don't think about it very much, when they're not challenged by a moment like this one. So, for as much terrible suffering that this moment is introducing, at this particular moment, there's room for people to pay attention. Perhaps after the economic difficulties set in, it will be more difficult. I don't know. I hope not. But now we're at home. Most of the people, I simply do not know anyone who has the virus except those 2 people, where the man died from it and the woman had no symptoms. So, the people that I know, the people I'm in touch with, some people have been sick, but they haven't been tested for the virus. I also think maybe I had it because I was in Spain with a lot of Chinese people on January 28th, and coming into Spain, it was Chinese New Year's, and I got quite sick about 4 or 5 days later, and I was sick for quite a while, but it was like an intense cold, except that it had weird features and so on. But unless they have a serum test, I can't get tested for the antibodies. But I have a feeling a lot of people have had the virus already. particularly in cities, you know. And so I don't somehow feel that the virus, to me, like the virus is the teacher right now. It's not actually creating conditions moment to moment for most people to really be so scared. You know, they're creating the conditions psychologically. But then once people don't have jobs to go back to, or people, you know, can't pay the mortgage and so on, I think that transition, I don't know, it might be more difficult. So, but that's the way I think about dying.
Thank you, Polly. I think you just suggested a title for this conversation, Coronavirus as the Teacher. And I thank you very much for your time. It's been lovely to listen to you.
Well, thank you. And I'm sorry if I talk too much. I can
It was beautiful.
Okay, thank you, Stefano.
Thank you very much.